Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this virtual event. My name is Chris Armstrong. I'm the Special Gifts Officer for the Spectrum Center at the Office of University Development. This year, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Spectrum Center. The center, established in 1971 by Jim Toy and Cindy Gare, is the oldest center for LGBTQ plus students on a college campus in the country. Throughout this year, we'll be celebrating this anniversary with events across campus. During today's event, celebrating the 50th anniversary, we're talking about the activism of the LGBTQ plus movement, where we've been over the past 50 years and where we must go in the next 50. We'll save times for questions at the end, but if you think of one along the way, please put it in the Q&A window anytime during the event. Additionally, captioning is also available during today's program. To view captions, please click on Live Transcript at the bottom right hand of your screen, and then press Show Subtitle. To begin our conversation, I'm delighted to introduce the director of the University of Michigan Spectrum Center, Will Sherry. Will?
Hi, good afternoon, Chris. Thanks so much for the introduction. My name is Will Sherry, and I'm the director at the Spectrum Center. I use he and him pronouns, and I'm really excited to be here today. For those of you that had joined, there was a little slideshow going, and all of the rainbow and a welcoming tabling of students, it just gets me excited, and it's definitely that time of year. So I've been out and about on campus and definitely excited to have a fall semester where some things can be in person and we can also take advantage of hybrid and virtual programming. We're really excited to be here and excited that people can be joining from all over the country. And this is something we definitely couldn't have done. So I am happy to be here welcoming you all. We're going to go ahead and get started. We don't have a ton of time, and we have a lot of wonderful people to hear from. So I'm going to start by doing an introduction, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So on behalf of the Spectrum Center and the event team, I want to introduce and welcome our first guest panelist, David Bonett. David is a proud Ross MBA alumnus, an active volunteer. After a successful technology career, he created the David Bonett Foundation to improve society through social activism. At U of M, the Bonett Foundation has supported the Spectrum Center and created the prestigious Bonett Leadership and Public Service Fellowship at the Ford School of Public Policy. We're fortunate to have David as an active volunteer, a member of the President's Advisory Group, and a friend to U of M. David has been an amazing friend to the Spectrum Center and has just supported us for many years, and we'll hear about some of that as we get started. So David, thank you so much for being here, for taking part in our Spectrum 50th anniversary kickoff event. I'm wondering if we can just start by hearing a little about when you first began the David Bonett Foundation. Take us back to what you were noticing at that time that fueled your commitment to effecting positive change through philanthropic support of community building and social activism. Just tell us a little bit about how that began.
Will, I'd be happy to. Thank you for the invitation to participate today. Thank you for that introduction. And even most importantly, thank you to you and your staff for your exemplary leadership of the Spectrum Center, which is a national and international beacon for our community's voice and spirit and equality. I'll go back to my time at the Spectrum Center, which started only 7 years after the Spectrum Center was founded. So I first got involved in 1978, and I was an MBA student at the business school, and I worked at the Spectrum Center first as a volunteer and then as part of my financial aid package for a work-study grant. And I trained directly with Jim Toy, and it was really, for a lot of the time, it was just me, or it was just me and Jim. And I would staff, we had a hotline at the time, I would staff the hotline, and we also had what was loosely called a speakers bureau. And Judy Levy and I, who was a fellow Spectrum Center volunteer and participant. She was in law school. She and I would go to psychology 101 classes on campus, just walk in and say, we're gay, ask us anything. And at that particular point, 40 some years ago, 43 years ago, many students had no idea. They'd never met an openly gay person. They didn't know anyone openly gay. So this was an opportunity for them to talk to their peers and ask anything that they wanted. So I really trace my activism back to the days when I was at the University of Michigan as a graduate student and worked at the Spectrum Center. And it was a fundamental experience for me that really ultimately led to your question, which is the founding of the David Bonett Foundation 21 years ago in 2000. And the catalyst for that really was my experience growing up as a gay man and my experience in the workforce, having very challenging circumstances and discrimination as an openly gay man, and ultimately forming a social network where I saw how important it was for people to connect with one another, particularly within our own community. So that was the catalyst for forming the David Bonett Foundation. It was really for, as you say, improving society through this broad range of programs for social activism, particularly focused on our community. And marriage equality was something back 21 years ago that I felt was an important milestone to achieve. And at that point, we had no domestic partnerships, we had no civil unions, and marriage equality was way, way, way far on the horizon. And so I knew that it just like now, but I knew then it would take a long, sustained commitment for positive social change. And I learned that through seeing Jim Toy's commitment. I learned that through seeing the impact of the Kennedy Center. I learned that from my former partner, Judge Rand Schrader, who was one of the co-founders of the LA Gay and Lesbian Center. And I started the foundation with the intent of playing the long game in social change. And for those of us that are on this call and that are long on this journey, I think you share my views that we're here, we're queer, we're not going anywhere, and we will work until our work is done. And that was always my philosophy and my view. And through the Bonett Foundation, we would fund various organizations that were focused on LGBT equality across the spectrum and Spectrum Center. One of our signature programs that we did start at the very beginning of the program was to create computer labs within LGBT computer centers, community centers. And we now have 60 some David Bonett cyber centers across the spectrum and across the country at both university campuses and in community centers. And I thought for this particular program 21 years ago that there were many people that didn't have regular access to the internet, and it was important for connecting with others and learning and applying for a job. And believe it or not, that need is still as great as it is today as it was then. So that program continues very strong, including at the University of Michigan. So our work continues. We did fortunately play a part along with so many others across our country to achieve marriage equality, but that was just one milestone, and there's still so much work left to be done.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that gives us a sort of good introduction into, your own connection to the Spectrum Center. I knew, but many probably didn't, that you were answering crisis calls when you were in the MBA program here, and that you were, helping students navigate their own experiences and identities. And that you mentioned that, some might think like the cyber centers, were needed at a point, but we have one in our center. And it's so true that, even more so now, when without access to technology, you are really stuck in what you can do, right? That so much more is really reliant on having that regular access, that we still see that need all the time. And that cyber center being able to fill that need. Yeah, go ahead.
There's something to be said too about, and this is why the Spectrum Center and other similar organizations are so important, because there's something very important about creating safe spaces. And there are other places, certainly other places on campus and elsewhere, that people would have access to the internet. But it's important for so many members of our community to do it in a safe space, in a welcoming space, where they feel like they're a part of a community and around other people. So I knew from the beginning that was important, but I see how important it is even now. So to your point, Will.
Yeah, it's so true. As we were looking at kind of coming back physically to the center and thinking about, how important that space is when so many people haven't had access to sort of physical spaces in this way, and still many don't, depending on, people's ability to sort of come back to campus. And looking at even Ann Arbor and knowing we are one of few spaces. We are, it's so important, and we're seeing that influx of students. We're seeing how important that is by, I think I was sharing with someone, we had almost 100 students dropping in the first week. Right. Just ready to, to really be in a space that they can just feel affirmed, even if you don't talk to anyone. That space is so critical. And that those needs that you're talking about, although shift over time, also many remain the same, or show up differently. So I think that I find myself always reflecting on, I really value that, like, I am in this space all day. And it's easy to forget that not everyone is when you work in a Spectrum Center, and it's an amazing environment. And the fact that you all, you've contributed so much to the creation of those spaces is, I think, so impactful for students. I see it on students' faces when they come to a table, and you can tell they've been waiting a lifetime. They have been waiting a lifetime to be at that table, saying, like, I'm here. I'm ready to be involved. And so this past few weeks have been very moving in that way. I want to just shift a little bit to talking about what role you have seen funding research has played in supporting activism, both in LGBTQ issues and other areas. I know you're very connected and supportive of research agendas and what they can do to change culture. So if you could just share a little bit about, the impacts you've seen of research on advancing social issues.
It's a very good question. There's two organizations in particular, among others, but two organizations that we've supported for a long time. One is the Movement Advancement Project, and that is a research-based organization for the advancement of all issues within our own movement, called MAP, Movement Advancement Project. And the other is the Williams Institute at UCLA. And it's a thoughtful question, because people often wonder just like you asked, what is the value of the research? Well, in the work that I've done with my colleagues over the years to put forth our agenda, you have to do this at the local, state, and national level for a lot of these changes. And it also happens within the private sector. But these changes and the proposed changes that we've worked so hard for, we learned we're much more effective in our activism if it's backed up by data, if it's backed up by analysis, if it's backed up by how many kids, how many gay kids attempt suicide every year, how many actually succeed, how many kids are tossed out of their houses, how many gay kids are homeless on the street. And so that kind of research, backed by a credible institution, is a major factor in social change. And so funding that research has been a critical tool, both with the Williams Institute, particularly with the Williams Institute in marriage equality, and then the Movement Advancement Project in helping secure funding for state and national funding for community centers across the board. Because as government leaders and government policymakers do their job, we hope, they put forth our agenda backed by data. And then that leads to money, and then that leads to hiring people who get these programs off the ground and get these programs done. So that kind of research and that kind of data gathering and data analytics is more important than ever. If people are approached or have the opportunity to participate in a credentialed study, and I've done some studies at Michigan, I've participated studies in various schools at Michigan, I would encourage people to participate, because that data is extremely valuable for pushing our agenda forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's something that, you know, I think is very critical to college campus. Certainly students' involvement in this research. I have seen in the organizations you mentioned, Movement Advancement Project being one of them, that there is so much to gain in the participation of being a part of a study. As you mentioned, I've certainly done also, and we get lots of requests through the Spectrum Center to share some of that opportunity. And it's an amazing opportunity to participate, as well as to, you know, be informed, or I know we'll hear more from some faculty to engage students on research teams, which has been an amazing part of seeing them see research as an opportunity for activism and as a critical component of activism, as you mentioned, which has just been, I think, life-changing for a lot of students, as far as another avenue that they can look at as a career. What
it also helps to do, Will, is help, and I'm sure you found this, help set benchmarks so that the data that you provide, you know, is published comparing data from other centers and other organizations, and that helps you look at ways within your own organization to be more effective. And I found that to be, you know, a real important part of the research effort as well.
It absolutely has. I think, you know, being able to connect with other spaces looking to make similar impacts and say, like, how have you been successful? What has that looked like, has been a huge part of the Spectrum Center, and what we, I think, you know, are responsible for giving back to the field as well. Right. That we've, you know, like you said, we've been in it so long that we have things to offer. And ways that we can help other spaces, as your foundation has, to see those opportunities and to take them. So I really appreciate that perspective. I'm wondering too, you know, what do you hope to see for the Spectrum Center and organizations like ours 50 years from now? What challenges do you foresee for future generations of community leaders and activists that help sort of propel us into the future? What are some things we should be thinking about now that is to come?
You know, I've been thinking about that question, and 50 years is a long time, but it does go by. Well, for one thing, I think it's breaking it's a couple of things. One, I think it's breaking it down into smaller goals, that, you know, once you achieve a goal, you achieve the next goal, and you achieve the next goal, and you achieve the next goal. There's a great documentary about 3 lesbian legislators in the California state legislature called Political Animals. And these 3 women were instrumental in efforts in California to secure protections for lesbian and gay people. And they use an analogy that if you start with a blank, if you start with a Christmas tree that has no ornaments on it, and you start with the very simplest of legislation, which is maybe hospital visitation. So if you can get hospital visitation, you can put an ornament on the tree. And then you start with the next, the next small piece of progress, which is perhaps insurance benefits, and maybe you put that ornament on the tree. And as you pass this, and maybe you then start with, something like, we're still working for a lot of these protections, but some form of job or spousal participation in same-sex adoption. You put that ornament on the tree, and soon you've got all these small accomplishments, and the tree is full of ornaments, and then you can go for the big wins. And so that's what I would encourage us to think about, is continue to make incremental progress, just like we've been doing over the last 50 years at the Spectrum Center. And look how far we've come. The second, and I think equally important thing, and what I've seen evolve now over time, I've seen this evolve through the leadership at the Spectrum Center and elsewhere, is for us to broaden our focus as gay people to really embrace the sense that, if anyone's marginalized, we're all marginalized. So not just in our community. If anyone is suffering discrimination, we all suffer discrimination. And so broaden our focus to not take the eye off of our own struggles, but ensure that while working for our own struggles, we also help others in their struggles, because struggle for one is struggle for all in the quest for social justice. So I think the Spectrum Center has taken a lead in that and can continue to take a lead, not only within our community, but finding and encourage ways for people to broaden their scope even further for social justice initiatives.
Yeah, thank you so much. It is a lot. And like you said, that sort of momentum of, we are going to continue to work for pieces of this sort of puzzle toward equity, and that looking not just at our own movement is something that really resonates, I think, on campus with the work of the center. And certainly when I look at the work you do in the foundation, there is a lot of strength in your sort of movement across issue. Yeah. That's something that really comes to mind when I think of the Bonett Foundation, is this exemplar in really looking at how we can use tools across many movements and work together to say, okay, what works there? How does that look here? How do we do that together?
And, one more thing, Will, which is working across movements strengthens our work within our movement, because in all the work we've done in anti-gun violence work over so many years, we do that work in anti-gun violence as the David Bonett Foundation, and I do that work personally as an openly gay man. And so maybe I'll be working on anti-gun violence initiatives, but everyone pretty much knows, I'm also doing this as a gay man. So that really helps our own activism and social justice efforts as well.
Yeah, I think a critical piece that we, hadn't dug as much into is, we are certainly, of ourselves in our work, and we bring ourselves to that work, right. All of who we are, and that does, I think, in many examples for the center, strengthen our work, to have the various perspectives looking both within a queer movement and the intersections of our movement with many marginalized people is critical to advancing all of our equity. Right. I'm gonna have one more question from audience, and want to make sure I get to a question from our audience before you and I have to wrap up. So the question is, for those who are not a part of LGBTQ plus queer community, but are wanting to be active in their allyhood, whether that's to support a friend, colleagues, loved ones, how can they be most effective in supporting a more equitable future, outside of, obviously, if one doesn't identify not participating in studies, but what are some things that you've seen in people's work who may not be a part of the community? And you just spoke to, I think we all do work that might be outside of our individual experiences. but that we're invested in. What are some thoughts you have on how people can do that well, what that could look like?
It's a good question. And you know, the traditional definition of coming out has to do with the individual coming out, self-identifying as a gay person. And for me, that's what I did when I was coming out. But that definition applies to non-gay people as well. I mean, you can also come out as a supporter of our community and go through the same process that I've had to go through, and those of us had to go through that are members of our community. And so coming out has to do with self-declaration, which is, you know, I've come out as a feminist, and I'm open about it, and it's how I live my life, and it's how I structure my dealings with other people, and it's the lens I view the world. And so, you know, I would embrace that sense of coming out and self-identifying as an ally and member of our community, and then the work just flows from there, and the impact flows from there.
Yeah, thank you so much for that note. I think, you know, part of what I hear in that is it's incredibly important to be engaged, to be vocal, and to state our values. Right. You know, in all of the spaces that we're in, to be fully, you know, engaged and open about the way in which we see the world and the way in which we expect to sort of work towards equity. And that really resonates with, you know, how we all show up in spaces.
So one specific example would be, you know, if people want, you know, another example, one specific example would be whatever environment you're in, you know, you look around and you just say, are trans people welcome here? You just say, gee, you know, are trans people welcome in this, whether it's a company or an organization, and you just ask, and if there aren't here, maybe they don't feel welcome. And what do you think we all can do together to make them feel welcome? So it's those, you know, it's asking those kind of questions in environments that help people, you know, think and make a difference.
Yeah, that sometimes the importance of stopping and really thinking about what someone else's experience might be like in the situation that I'm in right now, in the environment that I'm in. Yeah, that reflection, we often do trainings and workshops and things like that. And, you know, I think often people are looking for the answer, right? Like, what should I do? How should I be? And sometimes the answer is, you know, the self-work. How can I reflect? How can I think about and take on different viewpoints? And I think that, you know, that's often where we land in questions like this. What can I do? Sometimes it's, you know, what work do we need to do for ourselves in our own spaces? So thank you so much for those reflections, for getting this event kicked off with some of your personal experiences connected to the Spectrum Center, as well as your work experiences. I so value every opportunity that we have to connect virtually and in person. So I so appreciate it. We're gonna switch over to a special video that we have that is pre-recorded announcement and welcome from Mayor Lori Lightfoot. So I'm gonna switch over, we're gonna share that video, and then we're gonna talk to some of our faculty panelists.
Great, thanks, Will.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Will, for that introduction and for the important work that you do. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot. As Will stated before, I'm a proud alumna of the University of Michigan. This school has had an enormous impact on my life, helping me develop the strong sense of community and the understanding of hard work that has allowed me to become who I am today. It's also provided me with a strong system of support and fellowship that has been there for me every step of the way. As such, I'm so honored to celebrate the Spectrum Center and the work that they have done for 50 years as a crucial resource for members of the LGBTQ+ community, granting us not only a supportive and accepting space, but also a place where we are able to learn, grow, and thrive. This system of connection and support enables people to become pillars of their own communities and in turn provide these same resources to others in need of support. Today, I'm also excited to announce a special event to celebrate the Spectrum Center and its mission. On September 25th, at the U of M homecoming football game against Rutgers, Go Blue, the U of M Marching Band will be presenting a Spectrum Center themed halftime show, wherein they will take the field in honor of the Spectrum Center and all of its accomplishments throughout the years. I want to thank the Michigan Marching Band and everyone who made this celebration possible. I hope everyone there enjoys the rest of this event. Thank you, and as always, Go Blue.
Well, I want to thank Mayor Lightfoot. I didn't mention, as she said, that she is an alum, but now I will. She is an undergraduate alumni of U of M, and we did a little research after our preparation for this event and dug around and found out that she did play the trumpet and some info about her. So we're really lucky to have that special video, the announcement of the homecoming halftime show from the Michigan Marching Band, and we will be sharing that for those not at the game. We will be sharing that after, so know that you'll be able to see that video and enjoy that show even if you're not at the game that weekend. So we're looking forward to that, and I want to bring us back to talk a little bit more with two of our faculty who I'm going to introduce now about some of their own research and impacts on queer community and some retrospective. So we have both Dr. Nadine Hubbs and Dr. Shanna Kattari. Dean Hubbs is a professor of women's studies, music, and American culture in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, and the director of the Institute for Research on Women and Genders Lesbian-Gay-Queer Research Initiative. Dr. Shanna Kattari is an assistant professor of social work, and assistant professor of women's studies in the College of LSNA, and the director of Sexuality, Relationship, Gender Research Collective. So I want to thank you both so much for participating in this 50th anniversary kickoff event. I have a couple of questions that we'll start off with, but just to note, I talk with lots of students. They hang out in the center and they talk about their classes. And I have to say, you two come up so often as faculty that really impact their lives, as you know, as incredibly important mentors for them. So I just want all of our attendees to know you're going to be speaking on your research, on your teaching, but that like in the everyday lives of students, your presence is incredibly meaningful. So I'm excited to have you here. I know that your work is meaningful well beyond our campus as well. So I want to start off by just asking you to share a little bit about your own research and the impacts of your work on the lives of queer people. And I'm just going to pass it first over to Dean to get us started, and then over to Shanna.
Thank you so much, Will. And it's really moving to hear that about the students. And as someone who is a musicologist and an LGBTQ studies person, I was so excited to hear that Mayor Lightfoot was a marching band alumna, and had no, I guessed her as a brass player. I was glad to know that I got that right. As a former brass player myself. So I have been so fortunate to teach undergraduates and graduate students at University of Michigan in LGBTQ and gender and sexuality studies for 21 years now. And the way that has given me a front row seat on social change and on changes in identities and notions of gender, sex, and sexuality has just been incredible. I cannot imagine a better way to keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on than to work with these micro generations of students and to see the incredible change in this amount of time. And even over just a few years, you're like, wake up, things are really changing, it's all different. So it's been a time, my past 21 years of doing this teaching, a time of a great deal of change. And yet, all along, the Spectrum Center has been really relevant. We've never outgrown the need for the Spectrum Center. The Spectrum Center has had to really keep up with all this change too, and has done so. My work has been on queer people in relation to music. So my most recent book, in particular, Rednecks, Queers, and Country Music, and I've also taught a course at Michigan by the same title for the past 12 years, has brought a focus on how LGBTQ plus people are present in rural spaces and in the working class. And so I hear a lot from people all over the country and sometimes all over the world who write to me and talk to me about that because it's so important to them and it hasn't been given voice very much. I also do a lot of media work, like my appearance in the Dolly Partons America podcast, which was the Jolene episode, and the little lesbian verse that I added on to Jolene, having no idea that the hosts were best friends with Dolly Parton and they would just turn around and play it for her. It all worked out fine in the end, but I had a few tense weeks realizing that they knew Dolly and they played this if you tweak the final verse, lesbians have been doing this for years and years. They hear Jolene as a queer song, so I just went there. That's some of what I teach in courses like Rednecks, Queers, and Country Music. So you have your outreach in the world through your research, you have readers, you have, if you do this media work, public engagement, you have an influence in that way. But my teaching, my work in the classroom with these students year after year, and if I think back to those students who were 21 years ago, they're now 41-year-old people who have been out in the world, and they maybe spread your influence, these Michigan grads, far more than any public you could ever reach. And they spread it in such a way that they go out as young people, really energetic, bright Michigan grads. And so, for example, somebody sent me a note a few months ago and said, hey, have you seen that some super young queer person is doing a summary of your Rednecks, Queers, and Country Music book on TikTok? And I look, it's been up a couple of days, it's already got 20,000 views. I can't have that kind of impact directly, but what I've really witnessed and been fascinated by over the past 20 years is how the combination of students with a privileged education that includes the latest knowledge about race and class and gender and sexuality have influenced society and have done so particularly in connection with new media, social media, their mastery of the technology and their mastery of how to get a lot of followers and a lot of attention. And it's amazing the sort of thing, like say Judith Butler, when her book came out in 1990, it was understood as only experts could really get this. And it is such popularized general knowledge by now through these kinds of processes, through young people who have an education like the one that they get at Michigan, and then have a hand on the levers really know how to communicate through the latest technologies.
Thank you so much. I definitely resonate in the Spectrum Center with a lot of what you're sharing, and what you've offered that I'm thinking about too is, we can often think of faculty around, research and teaching, but what you're offering too is those are connectivity points that really just ripple effect. That really, these are the places you can have influence, and you're saying this is the type of influence I can have, and that it's, purposeful, strategic, and personal. And I really appreciate that. That is, I think, in some ways, not always a perspective that everyone has coming into thinking, how does your work influence queer people? That I think often we go to, this research article, which absolutely, but also how do people get that aren't in the classroom? How do people have access to, and how's that changed? Absolutely resonates, and I can see Shanna nodding as well. And I'm wondering, Shanna, if you can share some of thoughts on the similar question, your own research, your work, your teaching, the impact that you see that having on the lives of queer people.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Will. I'm Shanna Kattari, use they, them pronouns. I'm a white, purple-haired femme wearing blue polka dot glasses and a teal dress in front of a bunch of books and plants. Yeah, so as far as my research, this is my 5th year, so I certainly don't have nearly as much experience at UM as Dean does. But I have to say the Spectrum Center is actually one of the reasons I chose UM as a place for my academic home. I'm a queer non-binary femme and wanted somewhere that I could be authentically myself. And I think having such a well-regarded center is usually a good sign of how things go on campus. But I also didn't want to end up in one of the super queer zones, where a lot of the work has already been done. I really wanted to come somewhere where the work was happening and where there was a lot of community engagement. And so since joining here at University of Michigan, I've been lucky enough to partner with various organizations throughout the state, but my main community partner is Transcend the Binary, which is a Detroit organization that does both case management for trans and non-binary folks, as well as some advocacy, and they're really interested in doing research. So we actually partnered in 2018 to do the Michigan Trans Health Survey, which was the first health or actually trans survey at all for the state of Michigan, really to get a baseline, to give them some research on how to advocate at the state level for better inclusion in certain bills for trans folks, for insurance advocacy, to make sure trans coverage is there, around sexual health and sexuality. And one of the things that came out of that as well was the trans inclusive provider scale. So we actually had trans people across Michigan say, this is what it means for a healthcare provider to be inclusive for me. And we did our statistical analysis, which I guess is probably not as thrilling for most people as it is for some, but we came up with this scale of questions and subscales, which is really neat because it's for everyone, right? It acts as a training tool, right? So if I'm gonna go do a training for medical professionals, I can have them take the scale beforehand and maybe 6 weeks later and see what stuck. It's really helpful for professionals themselves. Even taking the scale gives them some ideas of what they can do to increase inclusivity for trans and gender diverse folks in their practice. And I'm actually right now in communication with some folks at the University of Pennsylvania and a community org around creating an app where trans people can use the scale to rate their providers, and providers can also use it to rate themselves. So kind of like a Yelp of trans inclusive providers, where providers can say, yeah, we got this number, and a person might go and be like, yeah, they actually weren't that good. This is where I put them at. And so then there can be a conversation around what training is needed, and trans people can know who is actively doing things right now that are inclusive. So I'm really proud of that work. I'm hoping that will kind of create ripples as it goes, both with kind of the public piece, right, with this app and how that works, as well as the trainings that I do with providers on the back end, as well as, you know, academically being really able to have a conversation around what does it mean to be inclusive, not in how cis people think it is, but actually what trans people are saying is what makes a provider inclusive. But what I really want to focus on for a moment is this paper that was published with funding from the Spectrum Center. I'm going to drop it in the chat here. And I'm delighted by this paper because it is a culmination of my teaching, mentorship, and research all coming together. And so it's the lead author on this paper is Nina Jackson-Levin. She's one of our doctoral students in the School of Social Work and also in anthropology. And it's called We Just Take Care of Each Other, Navigating Chosen Family in the Context of Health, Illness, and the Mutual Provision of Care Amongst Queer and Transgender Young Adults. And it's open access, so anybody can read it. You don't, and we tried to make it pretty accessible as far as readability, so it shouldn't be too frou-frou or you know, high theoretical. But it actually came out of a class. I was teaching a doctoral level class that had a couple of our Masters of Social Work students in it on policy and practice within the LGBTQIA2S+ community. And Nina had come up for her final project, was doing this really deep theoretical look at chosen family as a concept for queer folks and kinship care. And some of our students were really interested, our MSW students, and were like, well, what if we actually did a study around that? Like, what would that look like? And I was like, well, we should do a study. And Nina was like, well, where do we get money? And she went to the Spectrum Center, who was kind enough to fund her with what in academia is a small grant, but for doc students and MSW students was a very generous grant that allowed the MSW students to get paid to do the interviews and transcription. It allowed us to give kind of incentives to our participants, which we think is really important when we're asking people to share their stories with us. And these students, the three of them, they did all of these interviews, they did the transcription, we did coding together. And so I was kind of training Nina, who then in turn was training these MSW students, almost creating this like intergenerational queer mentorship, which is something that I teach a lot about it around queer mentorship. And it was published, and also with the funds from Spectrum, we were able to go and present it at a conference, and it was all three students' first conference that they were able to present at. And so it's really this beautiful piece that I think is an example of, as Dean was speaking to, the different ways that impact happens, right? It doesn't necessarily happen when I publish a peer review article, and it doesn't even happen necessarily when I do a Medium piece or put something out there, right? For me, it happens, and again, very much in line with Dean, it's how what I do then lights a spark in other people, and then they light a spark, right? And it's a continuation. And I see that in the classes I teach. I love when students I've taught before are now offering CE courses to other social workers on how to be more inclusive in their practice of queer and trans folks. I love being able to refer community members to our former students, you know, who are doing an amazing job doing that. I love it when students come back to do a PhD with me or elsewhere, right? And taking our ideas and that Michigan difference and taking it elsewhere. And so I really love that Michigan has given me the opportunity to develop new courses. I teach a sexuality and social work course. I teach a social work practice with LGBTQIA2S+ individuals and communities. I do a lot of independent studies. I've gotten funding to create the Sexuality, Relationship, and Gender Research Collective, which is now based with folks. We have about 45 individuals across US and Canada. So there's just been a lot of really great opportunities to not only do the research that I think is meaningful, but to ensure that communities have access to it, are engaged in it, are creating it, and that our students are really embodying what does it mean to be truly liberational and anti-oppressive in our work. And again, going back to what David had said, right, our liberation is all tied together. And so really imparting these ideas here at Michigan has been a joy for me.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that article also. That's really exciting. And I think it's newer for the center, and a lot of people don't know that we are providing more opportunities to fund these intersections of academic research, of sort of identity exploration, professional identity growth, alongside faculty mentors. that can really do all of what you described. And I especially appreciate, yes, not large in the academic sense, but meaningful. Opportunities where many people who couldn't participate if it wasn't paid, right? That would need to be getting jobs elsewhere that can really get funded to do some things that they're passionate about and want to do. And that's really in line with I think, some of our future. And I have time for one more question, then hopefully maybe an audience question as well. But I'm wondering, what you all see as some of the, similar to David's, the question for David, what you see as some of the challenges and opportunities for the future. We had, I don't know if we'll have time, but we had an audience question that was asking about activism on campus and how, certain changes on campus, like expansion of benefits, non-discrimination, often historically, and Dean, you might have some perspective, a lot of faculty activism and staff activism historically for some of the expanded changes on our campus. And the question the audience had was, how do we see the balance of staff, faculty, student activism making changes now and into the future? So yeah, just wondering what you see as some of the really important areas to be focusing on in the future, what you see as some opportunities, and certainly, anything you might want to reflect on your own activism in the many hats that you both hold. And why don't you start us off, and then we'll send it over to Shanna, and then we'll start to wrap up.
My work has mainly been as a scholar and a teacher. It doesn't leave me a lot of time to pursue activism, and or it's not an area that I have been engaged in directly so much as I have taught histories of activism, and my students have a lot to bring into the classroom in terms of sharing their experiences in activism. To address this question, which like David, I find it a bit mind-blowing to think 50 years on. I get how the Spectrum Center related to the last 50 years, but that's easy, right? And I get sort of what the pace of change has looked like over the last 50 years. But to think of the juncture we're at now, and not to get too doomish, I love David's vision about how the Spectrum Center would become a broad spectrum center of in solidarity with movements for all kinds of social change. And I think that's absolutely the way that things must go. And that is especially compelling because of our current moment, because basically I see that, in the starkest terms, in 50 years, we might have more Spectrum Center, or we might have less Spectrum Center. And on a good news side, if we had less Spectrum Center, it'd be, oh, there's no longer as much need, right? We've accomplished so many goals 50 years on in terms of making this campus and the society a better place for LGBTQ people and all kinds of marginalized people in society. But on the bad news side, we could have a lesser Spectrum Center because politics have gone further in a conservative or repressive direction. And I think that it's very clear that we need to work very actively against that vision of our future.
I'm on mute. Thank you for that. I think it's something that we're often talking about in the Spectrum Center. What would it be like to have made so much progress that at least what we're doing looks very different? But then on the other side, it's a concerning time. It has been, and it continues to be. And we can't forget that, to your point. that can, that we can't let up. And it needs to be very active. Shanna, I want to pass it over to you before we wrap up.
Yeah, again, kind of in response to both of the questions that are in the chat as well as yours, I think the current justices on the Supreme Court present a risk to everything, right? Not just legalization of marriage, but reproductive justice, which is a queer and trans justice issue, disability justice, trans justice, right? We've seen a lot of bills. And so I think we need to be afraid for a lot of reasons. And right, as I come from a community organizer and activist background, right, like this is where we do our best. This is where we come together and we join in mutual aid networks and we are outspoken and we don't let this be what stops us. And so I see that in our, we have a queer advocacy coalition that's on campus, or that's part of the School of Social Work, but they've kind of started expanding a bit more, and I advise them and they're wonderful. They did an amazing job last year pushing back against a homophobic microaggression that happened on campus. That was actually, their letter was picked up by NPR and all of these other things. So like Dean, I see a lot of my activism is through the work that I do with our students. And I think it also is the work that we do in talking about things on campus. I also do a lot of disability activism, which I think goes hand in hand with all of these other types of work. And so, I appreciate there's being captions on here. I appreciate people starting to put their pronouns in their Zoom names. I'm constantly talking in our faculty meetings about like, how do we make sure we don't misgender our students? How do we make sure that our case studies are not, a man and a woman who were married and did this, like that type of thing. And so a lot of the activism is within the school or within the university of really changing policies to be more inclusive and affirming across identities. I really want to talk a little bit about Spectrum Center over the next 50 years. I hope, right? Like our hope is that I think there will be a space for Spectrum. There's always going to be a space for Spectrum. I hope that we are at a point where it is less about safety and basic human rights, because I hope we get to that point. It's more integrated, it's more intersectional, it's more towards this collective liberation, right? And what I also am worried about is I think one of the biggest challenges is people are like, yes, eventually we're going to get to a place without labels and we can just be. And also labels can be so important and so affirming. And it, I think so much of the way we talk about queer and trans identities currently is within a trauma lens, right? Like, look at these hate crimes, look at this fear from the Supreme Court, the fear from the president, the fear from the Michigan legislature, right? Like all of these things. And I just want to remind us all, right, that like queerness and transness is not defined by trauma, right? There are these beautiful, like unique identities that are pieces of who we are. They deserve recognition and comfort and growth and a space to do that. And Spectrum holds that space, even when doing all of this other work. Like, I cannot tell you how often I have students in my class who come out in the middle of the semester, right? And are like, you know what? Like, I didn't know I was non-binary, but like between having you as my professor and interning at Spectrum and like doing all this stuff, like, I'm just going to try this out. I didn't know I could just try it and it would be okay if it didn't fit, right? Or like, hey, this was the first time I walked into a space and like there was signs for gender inclusive bathrooms and I'm in a space with other queer folk and we're not just talking about suicide risk, right? We're talking about like Marsha P. Johnston and like the amazing stuff that she has done for us. We're talking about Miss Major and how we support her retirement fund. We're talking about like what this looks like to be queer and trans outside of this deficit lens and looking at it more of a culture of abundance. And so I hope that Spectrum will continue to grow and engage and that all of us can find a culture of abundance in our queerness and transness. So that's my hope for the future.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's a real joy to be able to get also some affirmation and guidance to, what could the future look like? It is something we try to live in. Shanna, what you were saying in the Spectrum Center, there is so much to celebrate, not in spite of who we are, but just because of who we are. It is why Lavender graduation is one of my absolute favorite events, right? It is not, it is about celebrating us because we are great. and because we are amazing as a community. So I really appreciate all of you. David, thank you so much. Dean, Shanna, and to everyone who attended. And want to thank all of those in development behind the scenes, putting all of this event together, making sure we're ready, that everyone has their links, that we're all here. It is so helpful and allows things like this to be a success. So thank you to everyone so much for attending, for staying a minute over. We did it in an hour. I could talk to you all for so much longer. So thank you so much for the time and for everyone that attended. And I hope to be connecting soon. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your Monday.